Hello, everyone. So I'm really excited that I was asked to moderate this panel because I think, in much of my writing, I deal with, in this era, of attention to police misconduct and police brutality, I deal with people who are on the other end of it. And I tend to, hear one side of it. So I'm very, very privileged to be here to talk to actual police officers who are actually, dealing with the work. And I'm hoping that we can, get a different perspective and get to some of the roots of, some of the things that we've been seeing and we've been talking about in this country for the past couple of years. So I'm here with Ron Davis, who's the director of, all the way to my right, is the director of community-oriented policing services at the Department of Justice. Cathy, Lanier, who is the chief of police for Washington, D.C. And Virginia Matias, who is a police officer on the beat in Camden, New Jersey. I have a lot of questions for you. So I'm just trying to make you nervous. No, I'm joking. So I think, I want to start with Chief Lanier because I want to get this like right out of the way. We just had a panel. Folks just viewed a video and a film of an incident that happened. I viewed it myself. I think for all of us who have seen it, who are citizens, it's disturbing. And I just wanted to give you an opportunity to respond before we move forward.
So I have seen the video. I've seen parts of the video, not all of it, and I know there's still some production going on with finishing the film. Of course, when I saw it, I tried to do some research. Was there a complaint filed? Because I just saw it recently, and it happened, I believe, back in 2012. So the first thing I did was look to see, was there a complaint filed? What happened with the charges? So on and so forth. And then I reached out to Calvin, just because I felt like I should reach out to Calvin and offer an opportunity to speak with the family about the incident. I always say, because I've learned the hard way in my career, when I see video of something, an interaction with police and community members, I'm not going to comment on that specific piece of video. Now, there was no complaint filed, so no investigation was done, and so I don't have the benefit of hindsight that this was all looked into and there was statements taken and all that other stuff. But I normally don't comment on those things anyway, because just as soon as I make a comment on a piece of video that I see, inevitably another piece of video or something else will surface. But I will say this about that interaction. Anytime I see an interaction between a community member and a police officer that ends badly, and there's a lot of ways they can end badly, and in this case, you have a family or a father who's saying, my kids are now afraid of the police. To me, that ends badly, right? So anytime I see anything like that, it bothers me, because there's too many positive things that police officers do every day and interactions in the community for one incident to change a family's perception, and we have to make sure that that doesn't happen. So I also think, in terms of watching the snippets of video that I saw with Calvin, is it just takes one or two small things to change the tone of an encounter with a police officer, and sometimes it is the tone of the police officers. Sometimes it's the way you say something, or how you say something, or the way your body language when you approach the circumstances you're at the time. But once that tension starts, it tends to not stop. And so I think the important thing for us as police officers to remember is that you have to be very, very conscious of the way you approach people and the way you speak to people. Most people get defensive if they feel like you're being offensive. So being very respectful, in encounters, and request, if it's not a crisis, if it's not a dangerous situation, request versus demands, those things change the dynamics a little bit. So that's kind of what we try and educate our police officers, the importance of encounters. You don't have authority and respect just because you wear a uniform. I tell every rookie that. You just don't. The uniform is going to represent either fear and oppression or hope and safety. You decide how people view that uniform. The uniform doesn't decide for you.
Sometimes I just want to ask you, somebody that's actually out there right now, when you are in an interaction with a community member, you're not sure what's going on. do you, try to communicate with that in mind? What is your approach when you're actually out there on the beat?
Well, my main approach is to engage the community, ask them questions, see how their day's going. Just as I'm just walking my beat on a regular day basis, I'll try to engage them, say, hello, how are you doing? Good morning. And sometimes they're like, hey, officer, how's everything with you? And then we'll engage in a conversation. So my main approach is to get to know my community where I work at. Because if something happens there, they're more likely to speak to you because they already know you. Like, okay, maybe they might not speak to that officer because they don't know them, but like, oh, I'll speak to Officer Matias. She works here. I know her. So they feel more comfortable.
And can we talked about this backstage. Will you just tell us a little bit, because I think it's very important, about why you became a police officer?
Well, I always wanted to be a police officer, but several things happened throughout when I was younger and older. When I was growing up, my mom owned a convenience store, and I was around kindergarten at the time, but she was robbed at gunpoint at her bodega, which is like a local grocery store. And she always tells us a story about that, and it was scary because I could have lost my mom that day. And then as time went on, a lot of my other family members, they own like small groceries, and then one of my uncle, he owned a small grocery in North Camden, and it was around 2003, and he was robbed and shot, and he died from that wound. So that really impacted me. I was like, wow, that really hit close to home, because I lost a loved one from an act of violence. So I think from there, I knew I needed to make a change in my community, and I felt like I wanted to help and make a difference.
Do you feel like you're making a change? Do you get that feeling?
I do. When I speak to, especially with the children, and change their perspective, maybe, I don't know what type of encounter their parents might have or what they're being told or anything, but when I speak to them and they're like, hi, officer, how are you doing? When I grow up, I want to be an officer. I think that's great that they see me and they're like, oh, I could do it. She's a female. And also when you engage them, you're changing their perspective. So they could feel it for themselves, how they want to engage with them.
Well, I'm interested. This is a little bit of a wild card, but I was listening to Chief and they talk a little bit, and I wonder, as a young person, I don't know your background at all, but as a young person, what your relationship was like with the police, what your perception was like the police. Did your parents have a talk with you, or and I don't want to put anything on you, but I just want to know, like, what was your experience like? Do you come from a law enforcement family? What was it like?
Right. So let me start by saying with Officer Matias is being very modest. So she's an outstanding officer, but she recently had a meeting with President Obama with about 5 other officers to really talk to him about what it's like to be a rank and file officer, what community policing looks like, and really help shape the views for the administration of what a good community policing looks like. So she's really, to the answer, is she making a difference? Yes, she is. Yes. Now, for me, my father was a cop. So the good and bad of the side of that is, interesting you asked that, so I'm going to get myself in trouble here. So I had a little bit of protection that a lot of young men of color especially don't have. And that my father was a cop, I could basically invoke that privilege, and that's what it is, a privilege, when I decided to be youthful and knuckleheadish, that most young men are.
Young people.
Yeah, actually young people. I have 2 daughters too, so I stand corrected, absolutely. But now as I stand here as a father, and I was a cop for close to 30 years, now I work for the administration, and people don't like to hear this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Now as I stand here as a father, my son just started his freshman year in college. And when I remember when he first got his license, I was then faced with the dilemma that every parent that especially has a young man of color in his family, and that is to have this talk. And I think this talk is a mandatory course for young men of color in this country, and that is what to do when stopped by the police. And I say that being very proud of the police. I say that thinking that the overwhelming majority have done a tremendous job and continue to do a tremendous job. I say that as one who's been proud to wear the badge for close to 30 years. But as a father, I still have to have that talk. And so now that my son is in college, I have multiple worries now. One is that he gets stopped, that there's not an implicit bias that makes him a threatening person simply because he's a young man of color. And he recently got stopped, which is interesting, after we had the talk. And he said the encounter went very well. He was speeding, got the ticket, so that part didn't go very well. But nonetheless, he got the ticket. But now I also have to worry about he's going to Northwestern, and he's in an area of a major metropolitan area, and I have to worry about violence. have to worry about that he's going to get caught up going out, having a good time with his friends, and get caught up getting hurt by gang violence. And then the one that every father has, that is that he does not bring me another grandchild until I'm actually ready.
Right.
So I have an older child who has one, which is okay because she's 26.
Right.
But so I was not really, when I grew up, I didn't have some of the challenges. And so I acknowledge that in that case, I grew up a little bit more privileged, if you will. But as a father, I'm concerned about it. And I think as a society, it really comes down to one question, if I may say this. The number one question that we have to ask, whether it's police chiefs, whether it's community members, all of us, white, black, across the board, is how do we see our young men of color? How do we view them? If we view them as a threat, then a lot of things become different. Reaching for a driver's license is no longer reaching, it's a furtive movement. Asking a question or being somewhat defiant in a classroom is no longer youthful exuberance, it now becomes willful defiance, and it becomes a crime. A lot of things come out of our fear, our implicit bias, and so we need to struggle with that as a people, quite frankly, and answer the question, how do we view our young men of color to make sure that we treat everyone with dignity and respect?
You know, oh, sorry, you know, one of the things we were talking about behind stage was, and this is just like a pet theory, you know, of mine. We live in a society right now where it strikes me as an observer and as a citizen that police officers are called into situations in which maybe, well, let's just say maybe bringing someone into the criminal justice system, maybe invoking the powers of the criminal justice system are not the best answer. As I said to you, Ron, I particularly think about that case, down in Columbia, South Carolina. But there's so many cases like that where you can see other societal things going on, be that some sort of drug issue that maybe could have been thought about from a public health perspective, be that with Walter Scott, where it actually starts with the child support system before you even get to, and that's not to excuse the office or anything, absolutely, but that's there. Or so often a mental health issue, you know what I mean, which is behind it. And I wonder, Chief Lanier, what your perspective is. Are we asking, to point blank, are we asking our police officers to do too much?
Policing has been pushing back on that for years and years and years, and really, policing has become, as I said, the analogy, policing has become the drive-through 24-hour McDonald's of services, right? Because we are the only 24/7, 365 days a year out there in the community, available when crisis hits, whatever that crisis is, or when something has to be solved. And when there's not other resources for it, the police will handle it. And to some extent, the community, if they don't know who to call, are going to call the police. And so I think there's a lot of things that we in policing try the best we can to train and prepare for, but we know that there's other people that are better for providing that service, that police, if we could get police out of that business, we would. So I think that is part of this. We really have to look at laws and enforcement versus regulation in some cases. Regulation is one thing. You don't need a badge and a gun to regulate things.
Wait, I'm sorry, can you make that concrete? Like what do you mean?
So there are some things that are violations of regulations where officers are sent out to enforce. So like minor violations of business regulations, or maybe even minor, what isn't criminal in some cases, minor single sale cigarettes, things like that. So are these things you really need to have a badge and a gun enforcing, or are these things that are more regulatory, that can be handled through a civil process and eliminate the potential for things to go bad? I mean, I think there's a lot of things. I mean, we certainly need the mental health training. I think we're going to deal with people in mental health crisis, but I would love it if people in this country knew that if they had a loved one who was in mental health crisis, that they could dial, another number other than 911 and get a mental health professional out that knows how to deal with that, versus a police officer who's been trained, but has been trained in a 40-hour course to try and deal with that.
Right.
Can I have one thing in there?
Yeah, please do.
Just make sure when we have this discussion that we go beyond the arrest. So, for example, I mean, we for the first time in 2014, we saw that our crime rates and arrest rates went down at the same time. So one, as a community, we have to accept that arrest does not automatically equate to public safety. Two, even once the arrest is made, we have to take a look at our sentencing and how long we're keeping people in jail. And this is an area that we're now seeing very bipartisan support that keeping people in jails for these extended period of times is costing us $80 billion a year. And that's the kind of money that can be reinvested into providing the services. It is $6,000 for treatment, $60,000 for incarceration. We're paying more to keep young men in jail than it would be to give them a full scholarship to Harvard. And so we need to look at our priorities and adjust accordingly so that we are preparing our young people across the board for society. And we need, and I'm looking at the community now, we need to convince ourselves that we don't fall for the temporary satisfaction that comes with a lot of arrests being made. That some of these problems were not created overnight, they're not going to be solved overnight. They require you, they require the police department. You are co-producers of public safety working together to make your community safe. If you simply ask for the police to do it, it's like saying that all I have to build this house is a hammer, which means everything looks like a nail, and it's going to go one direction and one direction only.
I actually like to go one step further than that. I was in this discussion with the criminal justice partners, all the justice partners the other day, and there was discussion about investing in drug treatment, once people get into the system. And really the solution for the criminal justice partners is for us to try and put ourselves out of business. I mean, isn't that ultimately the goal? Is that you should have the investment long before a person gets into the system. So how about the investment in prevention before you're incarcerated, not after you're incarcerated, because now it makes the challenges even that much more difficult. So, I mean, I hate to say my profession, but I mean, more investment in social services and less investment in police and incarceration is probably the long-term solution.
Right. So I know I have to open up the questions really quick, but I got to ask you guys about this. Ron, you alluded to this bipartisan moment that we find ourselves in from very, perspectives. I think there's a lot of interest in overall criminal justice reform, not just the police. And yet, I wonder, well, not I wonder, I think, that consensus is actually built on very, very thin ice. We are in a moment where compared to 20 years ago, the crime rates are much, much lower than they were. And yet, even still, we've heard quite a bit about this Ferguson effect that says in this moment where you have, Black Lives Matter movement activists out there observing police officers, filming police officers, that in fact some of the crime rise we've seen in our cities is that there's a direct relationship between those two things. We've heard this from, very, very high places, in our government. And I wonder what you guys make of it.
Yeah, I'll start. So one is, I think we are starting to see spikes in violence in certain cities around the country. And we have the obligation to do the research to find out why, to respond to the crime with empirical data so we go to the root causes of it. I want to be careful as we do that because a notion that suggests that America's finest that you're looking at right here on the stage would somehow not do their job, I do reject. And I don't think that's what's happening. The automatic connection between an activity and crime also, we know through history that we should not make that connection. We need to find out more data. We need to basically research it. We need to ask the tough questions, but we need to have the conversation so that we can have the courage to ask the tough questions, come up with the answers, and resolve it. And although we are seeing a spike, this is remind the community, this is still amid some 40, 50-year lows in crime. So before we just jump and assume that there's a national epidemic of violence, and all violence is obviously something we should deal with, we should take a look at what has got us there. Now, what's most heartening for me is I'm listening to my colleagues like Cathy and others, chiefs that are saying, look, we need to do it through evidence-based scenarios. We need to do it by not trying to arrest our way out of a crime. We need to do it by building social services and options. And the idea that policing in a democratic society means that public scrutiny is not a threat to policing, it is absolutely the foundation of it. That you must demand that the community hold the police accountable. That's the only way it can work. And if you think about it, the greatest exertion of government authority is the use of the force by local police. So it has to be criticized and scrutinized and evaluated. We just have to do it fairly so that the officers are treated with dignity and respect and that all sides of the story are heard before we make our assumptions or before we make our judgments.
I agree with him.
Okay. So I just got to, before we go to questions, and I'm just going to put this to you really, really quickly. If you, and I don't know if you've actually talked about this, I don't think you've been in this position yet, but if you walk out and you're doing your job and you see folks filming you on your on their camera phone, does that affect, your willingness to go do your job?
No, I act the same way if I'm on camera or off camera. I'm always remain professional and always treat everybody with dignity and respect.
Okay. All right. So I think we have time maybe for one question. I can't see where we're going. All right, here we go. All right, beautiful.
My name is Desiree. So if both officers were in the video, what would you guys do differently, or what would you do?
You're asking about the Calvin video?
Have you guys seen it?
So I've only seen bits and pieces of the video, and like I said, I saw it just a few days ago. But I will say this: in 25 years I've been policing here, and I started policing here in 1990 when we really had a huge violent crime issue in the district, and relationships were not very good with police. And I learned very quickly that sometimes the simplest of things can turn a normal encounter between a police officer and a community member in a bad direction very quickly. And when I say the simplest of things, it's just the tone of voice or the way you approach a person and the level that they perceive the way you respect them. And that goes both ways. I've seen it perceived lack of respect from the community member by the way or a tone that an officer uses them, and I've seen the same reaction from a police officer who feels they're not, and so you just have to, I have to say, I've spent the majority of my career making sure that I'm always conscious, especially when I enter a situation where there's already a crisis going on, somebody's already in a crisis situation, that I am very respectful of the fact that I'm entering someone's home or entering someone's community where there's already something bad happening, that I have to be the one that makes the effort to calm things, be respectful, and bring things back down to a tone where we can have a reasonable discussion first.
Okay, I think we got one more still. I think we still got time for one more.
This question is largely for Officer Lanier. I'm a community organizer. I was in Anacostia on Sunday at a community event, Black Joy Sunday, where we were harassed by police officers, and then we had a sergeant called to the scene, and the sergeant continued to harass the other organizers. I was de-escalating, and I asked the sergeant about his tone specifically and his level of respect. I said, "Sir, I've been in de-escalation trainings. I've never been in one where matching tone is a de-escalation technique," because he was yelling at the citizens. He turned to me and he said, "Well, we don't have de-escalation training. We get verbal judo." I would like you to speak to what verbal judo is and why we don't have de-escalation training for the Metropolitan Police Department.
So the first question I would ask, and you don't have to answer, is, and I tell people this all the time, if ever you have an interaction with a police officer that you don't feel that was appropriate for any reason, I would encourage you to make sure that you file a complaint so that the police department can look into those. And you don't have to file with the police department here, you can file with the Office of Police Complaints, so somebody outside can take a look at what happened and try and address issues. But I would say, before de-escalation was called de-escalation, because de-escalation has been taught in police academies since I came on in the early 90s. It has evolved over the years, and it's been taught in a variety of different circumstances. We try and teach it while we're in defensive tactics. We try and teach it while we're in various different scenario-based training. But we've been doing it for many, many years. And yes, years ago, so this officer had to be about 10 to 12-year veteran, because about 10 to 12 years ago, verbal judo was one of the best de-escalation trainings that there were out there, and it was taught nationwide, and it was very effective. So I don't know whether it was sarcasm or what, without having known all that stuff.
But could you tell us what verbal judo is?
It's de-escalation training. It was a different name. I'm sure you know, Ron. It was nationwide. Everybody.
It's been around for the 90s. It's the concept of judo. You redirect energy, so you're redirecting anger and de-escalating, so that you're talking your way down from situations. That's what it was designed to do. But I think since that time, that curriculum has been updated and modified and gets more into real base scenario training with de-escalation,
yes,
where you can test it. But so we both kind of smile, because that is going back a few years.
It's going back a little ways.
Yeah,
but we do reoccurrent training. So we still put officers through, when they go for their annual training, we still put them through de-escalation training as a part of their ongoing training. But if you haven't talked to somebody about that encounter, or if you want to give me the information or talk to somebody, I would encourage you to, so we could look into it.
Police departments, I've heard that police departments are hiring ex-vets, and that it saves them money and training and all of that.
Is that true, and is that the reason why it appears that black people and others are being treated less than human, as enemies?
Let me start with that one. So, one, for a lot of people here, happy belated Veterans Day. I would say even my office, as far as we provide a lot of grants for hiring, and we absolutely support the hiring of veterans. Not because it saves costs, it's because these are young men and women that are sacrificing lives for this country, and that we have an obligation to help them return back into the community and to provide support for them. In many cases, the military understands the disciplinary process. I think it's the training, not the idea that it's a veteran. Also keep in mind in this voluntary veteran force that the diversity of that force is pretty strong. In fact, one argument is that many of the volunteers are young men of color, young women of color. So I don't know if it's, I think it would be, I would just be cautious about making that assumption. I think where I would agree with you is we have to be careful that we don't militarize the police. But even the military will tell you that they are using different tactics on how to...
The military is teaching community policing in communities. And the military prior service does not afford you any opportunity to... You still go through the exact same... You still have to meet the same hiring requirements. You still have to go through the same police academy. It doesn't lower the standards. And what it does for me in Washington is it allows... We have a 60 college credit requirement. And some of our young men and women go off into the military and they don't go to college. And this affords those folks an opportunity to come onto the police department using their service in the military as opposed in exchange for the 60 college credits, which they can get when they come on the police department.
You got to let us talk.
These are our community members. These are our local community members. And they are. I mean, as I said, the military has been training community policing in communities for the last 8 to 10 years.
If I could add this, it may be if there's the feeling that communities are being treated as the enemy, I don't think we're pushing back on your feeling with that, and that may be the case depending on where you're living. And I think the challenge we're trying to look at in community policing change that. The only thing I would say is I don't think it would be accurate to attach it to one segment of policing being veterans. I think what I would take a look at, wherever there's this feeling, is the training of all your officers, how they're held accountable, how they are relating to the community. When you look at officers like that, because I just know as a former police chief that looking at the men and women that have come from service, and I'm a veteran, my daughter's a veteran, and with their sense of duty can be very, very positive. So that doesn't excuse that if a department is not engaging and not supporting and not treating the community right, but I just think we should be maybe cautious before we make that automatic link, but I understand the concern.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much.